That truck is not parked on your property, sir. It is parked on a community easement, and it has been removed accordingly. Those were the words Diane Falk left on my voicemail at 6:40 in the morning, in the flat, satisfied tone of a woman reading a sentence she had practiced. Diane was the president of the Cedar Hollow Owners Association, 4 years into a job nobody had run against her for, and the truck she meant was my own 1-ton flatbed, sitting where it had sat every night for 11 years, on the gravel apron of my own driveway, on a parcel my family had owned, since before Cedar Hollow had a name. What Diane did not know, what she had never once bothered to check in the binder of covenants she carried like a hymnal, was that the strip of ground she was calling a community easement had been deeded to my grandfather in fee simple in 1938, and that I had spent my working life as a licensed land surveyor who knew exactly where every pin on that property sat. So I want to ask you something before I tell you the rest. If a woman with a clipboard had your truck hauled off the dirt your own grandfather cleared and left you a voicemail calling it a courtesy, what would you have done? My name is Walt Brennan. I'm 62 years old, and for 38 of those years, I ran boundary surveys for 3 counties in the foothills, retiring with my license still active and a storage room full of plats I had drawn myself. A man learns things in that work that follow him home. He learns that the ground does not lie, that the pin in the dirt does not care who shouts loudest, that a line run true in 1938 is still true today, no matter how many letters a person writes about it. He learns to trust paper over people, because paper holds still while you read it. I spent 4 decades teaching ranchers and retirees and feuding brothers where their lines actually ran, watching the relief come over a man's face when the iron pin came up right where the deed said it would, and watching the other face, the one that had hoped the line was somewhere else, go tight and quiet. I knew both those faces, well before Diane Falk ever wore the second one, across a clubhouse from me. The property is 14 acres on the east slope above Cedar Hollow, a stretch of pine and pasture my grandfather bought off a rail company in the 30s, and my father held through 2 recessions. I can tell you the shape of it with my eyes closed. The pasture runs flat for a few hundred feet off the county road. Then the ground tilts up into Ponderosa, where the soil thins to decomposed granite, and at the top there is a bench of open meadow my grandfather cleared by hand with a borrowed team, where the grass comes in green a full week before anywhere else on the slope. The barn sits at the break between the flat and the rise. The house sits above it, looking down the whole length of the place, and from the porch you can see clear across to the far ridge, which is the view I would come to understand other people wanted badly enough to lie for. My wife Carol and I raised our boy on it. Carol planted a garden along the porch rail the first spring we lived in the house, peonies and irises and a row of climbing roses. She trained up the posts, and she passed 4 years back in the fall, after the roses had already gone to hips. Since then, it has been me and our grandson Eli, who came to live with me at 15 after his folks moved 3 states away for work. His father, my son, asked him to come along, and Eli stood in the kitchen with his hands in his pockets and said plainly, the way the boy says everything, that he would rather stay where his grandmother's garden still came up every spring. My son was hurt by it for a while, and then he understood. So when I say the gravel under that truck mattered, understand it was never about the gravel. It was about a boy who chose this ground, and a woman buried 2 valleys over who had put her hands in its dirt for 30 years, and a pin my grandfather drove with a maul before my father was born. Diane Falk thought she was moving a truck. She had no idea what she was reaching for. The morning of the voicemail, I drove down to the county impound in Carol's old sedan. and paid $240 in cash to get my own flatbed back. The man at the counter would not meet my eye. He slid me a release form and a tow invoice, and at the bottom of the invoice was a line that did more for my morning than any cup of coffee. The towing company was called Summit Hook and Recovery, and the authorizing party was listed as Cedar Hollow Owners Association, signed D. I folded that invoice into quarters and put it in the breast pocket of my shirt, and I did not throw it away. I have never thrown away a piece of paper that had a signature on it. That habit, more than my license, more than the old deed, is the reason this story ends the way it does. I should explain about the binder. Surveyors keep field books. You write down what you measured, when, in what weather, with what instrument, and you sign the page, because someday a lawyer is going to ask you to defend a line you ran 20 years ago, and your memory will not be enough. I never lost the habit. When Diane Falk sent her first letter, I started a manila folder and wrote the date on the tab in pencil. By the morning, my truck disappeared. That folder was 3 years thick. The first letter had come 3 years earlier in the spring, on Cedar Hollow letterhead, with a gold-embossed seal that I am fairly sure Diane designed herself. It came in a heavy cream envelope, the kind that costs more than the stamp, and Eli brought it up from the mailbox at the bottom of the lane and set it on the kitchen table next to my coffee. It informed me that my fence along the lower pasture was 11 inches into a community setback and would need to be relocated at my expense within 30 days. 11 inches. I read it twice. I read it a third time because 38 years of running lines had taught me that when a number is that specific and that wrong, somebody has gone to trouble to make a thing up. My fence sat exactly where the 1938 deed put my line, where the iron pin still stood under a clump of mountain mahogany, where I had personally reshot the corner 2 years before with a total station accurate to 1/100th of a foot. There was no setback. There was no community. There was a woman downhill who had decided my fence was 11 inches into something she had invented. I did not write back an angry letter. I have read 1,000 angry letters in my line of work, in case files and survey disputes, and not one of them ever moved a pin. The morning after the letter came, I drove down to the county recorder in Carol's old sedan and pulled the certified copy of the deed and the recorded plat, paid my few dollars for the raised seal, and drove home and laid all 3 documents out on the kitchen table in the morning light, the deed and the plat and Diane's cream-colored letter side by side. Then I took a photograph of the 3 of them, together with the date showing on my phone. Eli watched me do it over his cereal. "You taking a picture of paperwork," he said. I told him that someday a person was going to stand in a room and say a thing about this fence, and I wanted to be able to put the truth on a table faster than they could finish the sentence. Then I wrote one short reply, 3 sentences, stating that the fence sat on my deeded property and that I would be happy to walk the line with any licensed surveyor she cared to hire. I mailed it certified, kept the green card when it came back with a stranger's initials on it, and started a manila folder with the date written on the tab in pencil. That was incident 1. Diane did not hire a surveyor. People like Diane never hire the surveyor, because the surveyor would end the argument, and the argument was the point. Cedar Hollow had been built in the 90s on land downhill from my family's acreage, a development of around 90 homes with a clubhouse and a pool, and a covenant book thick as a phone directory. My 14 acres were not part of it. They predated it by 60 years and had never been annexed into the association. Diane, though, had decided, somewhere in the 4 years of her presidency, that the view from the upper homes belonged to Cedar Hollow, and my pasture and pines sat squarely in that view. What I learned later, And what reframed everything was that Diane's husband, Greg Falk, ran a development company that had quietly optioned the 3 parcels downhill from mine and needed a road easement across the east slope to make the numbers work on a 40-lot expansion. My land was the slope. A road across my pasture would have turned Greg's option into a fortune. Diane was not policing a setback. She was softening up a holdout. I did not know that in the first spring. I only knew a woman in a linen blazer had started sending me letters, and that I was going to keep every one of them. The second incident came that summer. I was at the feed store in town loading the cart when my phone rang, and it was Eli, 16 by then, his voice tight in the way a kid's voice gets when he's trying not to sound scared. "Grandpa." A pause. "There's a lady." She drove up the lane in a white SUV. "And she's taking pictures of the barn. She's got a clipboard." I could hear the porch screen door behind his voice. The dog barking somewhere off toward the barn. I told him to stay on the porch. Do not go down there. Do not argue with her. Just watch. I left a 50-pound bag of pellets sitting on the feed store counter, and a teenager named Dustin, holding my half-finished order, and I drove home faster than I should have on that grade. By the time I came up the lane, Diane was standing at my gate in a linen blazer and white sneakers that had never once seen mud, photographing my barn through the rails, lifting the camera and lowering it and lifting it again like she was building a case out of angles. I had not met her yet. I knew the name off the letterhead, and now I had the woman. I got out of the truck. "This structure," she said, before I had the door shut, before any hello, "is not in compliance with community aesthetic standards. The siding, the roofline, the color. We're documenting." I told her the barn was built in 1951, that it stood on my deeded land, and that it was no business of hers or her community's. She lowered the camera and smiled at me. And I want you to understand this was not a cruel smile. It was worse than cruel. It was the patient, sorry for you smile of a person who believes she is the only adult in the conversation. "Brennan," she said, "your property is functionally part of our community, whether the paperwork has caught up or not. Functionally part of our community." I said nothing. I had learned long ago that the worst thing you can do to a person who wants a fight is hand them a calm face and a closed mouth. She held the smile a moment longer, then got back in her white SUV with the vanity plate and rolled back down my lane. Eli came down off the porch. "What'd she want?" he asked. I told him I did not entirely know yet, but that I knew enough. That night I wrote her sentence down word for word on a legal pad, with the date and the time and the make of the vehicle and the plate. Incident 2. That fall, the fines started. They came one at a time, spaced out like a man laying bricks, each on the gold-sealed letterhead. A notice of violation for the fence, $50. 2 weeks later, a notice for the barn color. 2 weeks after that, a notice for a stock trailer parked in my own field, $50. Each one cited a covenant section number, neat as you please, section 4.2, section 6.1. And not one of those covenant sections had any authority over 14 acres that had never been annexed into anything. I did not pay them. I did not call to argue them. I photographed each notice the day it arrived, logged the section number and the amount and the date, and slid it into the folder behind the one before it. By the end of that year, the folder held 9 notices, and the running total of fines I had not paid and would never pay stood at $450. I want you to hold on to that number, $450. Because at the end of this story, there is another number sitting next to it, and the gap between them is the whole point. I did go see the county about it once, partway through that second year, when the stack got thick enough that I wanted a professional's read on where it was heading. I sat down across a metal desk from a deputy named Ray Soto, a calm younger man, mid-30s, who had grown up 2 valleys over and whose father I had run a line for. Back when Ray was in grade school, he remembered. He poured me a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been on the burner since morning, and he read through the letters and the fines, slowly, turning each one over, taking his time the way a careful man does. When he was done, he squared the stack and set his hand flat on top of it. Then he told me something I have repeated to a dozen people since. He said a private association can mail you any letter it wants, and the letters mean exactly nothing unless your land is bound by their covenants, but that the day they ever filed a formal complaint or took an action, the sheriff would have to respond regardless of whether the complaint had a lick of merit. Because that is how the law is written, and a deputy does not get to decide which calls are silly. He told me to keep doing exactly what I was doing. Document everything, he said. Date everything. Don't lose your temper where a camera can see it. Build the pattern. He tapped the folder twice. If she ever does something that crosses a line, you want a stack of paper so thick the judge reads it and rules from the bench before her lawyer finishes standing up. I thanked him. I drove home, and that same night I bought a second hard drive, so the footage off my gate camera had somewhere to live besides the first one. 1 copy is a hope. 2 copies is a record. The cameras went up after the 3rd spring when the harassment widened past me and reached the people I did business with. I still did the occasional survey for neighbors, retired or not, mostly small, lot stakings and fence line confirmations, cash work, a favor for folks who had known me 40 years. Diane figured out my clients. A rancher named Tom Whitfield called me one evening, embarrassed, to say a woman from the association had phoned him claiming I was operating an unlicensed business in a residential zone and that hiring me could expose him to liability. Tom laughed it off, but 2 others did not call me back at all. That season, I logged each one, the day Tom called, what he said, she said, and I asked Tom if he would put it in writing someday if it came to that. He said he would. That was the first time someone outside my own family offered to stand next to me on paper, and I wrote his name in the folder with a small star next to it. The 4th spring is when Diane sent the inspector. I came up the lane on a Tuesday afternoon, tired, a long day of staking corners behind me, and found a man in a yellow safety vest walking my pasture with a measuring wheel. Clicking it along ahead of him, a laminated badge clipped to his pocket flashing in the sun. He did not stop when I got out of the truck. He clicked the wheel another 10 feet before he turned. He told me, pleasant as anything, that he was conducting a compliance assessment on behalf of the association. I asked to see the badge. He unclipped it and held it up without handing it over, and I stepped close enough to read it. It was a printed card in a plastic sleeve, the kind you order off the internet for $19, with a logo that was not any county, state, or federal agency I had ever worked beside in 38 years of standing on job sites next to real inspectors. I have stood shoulder to shoulder with building officials and code officers and a state surveyor general. I know what a real credential looks like. This was not one. I asked him who had hired him. He said the management company. I asked him which management company, and he gave me a name I did not recognize and have reason to believe he made up on the spot. I told him he was standing on a deeded parcel that had never been annexed into any association, that he had no order and no authority to enter it, and that he was trespassing. He started to say something about scope of work. I told him, level, that I was a licensed surveyor, that he was on my recorded property, and that 2 cameras had been recording him from the moment his truck came up my lane, including the part where he said the word badge. He looked at the gate. He looked at the barn where the nearest camera sat under the eave. Then he folded up his measuring wheel and left. Without another word, I saved the footage to both drives that night. Eli watched me do it. 17 by then, leaning in the kitchen doorway with a glass of milk. He asked me why I did not just call the sheriff every single time something like this happened, why I let them walk back down the lane instead of having them hauled off in cuffs. It was a fair question, and it deserved a real answer. I turned the second drive over in my hand. Because the day I need the sheriff, I told him. I want him to sit down and read 3 years of this and know in 5 minutes who has been telling it straight and who has been making it up. You don't spend the pattern early. You let it build. Then you spend it once, all at once, when it matters. He thought about that. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "So you're not collecting letters, you're collecting the case." I told him that was the smartest thing anybody had said in my kitchen in a year. The count of incidents by then was somewhere past 20, and I had stopped giving them single numbers and started grouping them by year the way you group survey notes by project when one file gets too thick to hold. But here is the thing about a person who never checks the deed. They mistake your patience for weakness, and they keep climbing because nothing has stopped them yet. Every letter I did not answer with anger. Every fine I did not pay and did not fight in the way she wanted me to fight. Every camera I mentioned quietly instead of shouting about told Diane the same wrong story. It told her the slope was hers for the taking if she just pushed a little harder. She had no idea she was building my case for me, one signed letter at a time, and that a retired surveyor with a fee-simple deed and a 38-year habit of writing things down was the worst possible person in 3 counties to mistake for soft. The truck was the line she finally crossed. It was a Wednesday in early summer, the 5th year of it, and I had driven the flatbed home from a long day, staking a friend's property corners, and parked it where I always parked it, on my own gravel, 15 feet inside my own deeded line, well uphill of any road. I went. At 5 in the morning, I heard the diesel rattle of a tow rig down the lane, and the backup beeper, and by the time I had my boots on and got to the window, the flatbed was already winched up at an angle and rolling out toward the county road. I stood on the porch in the gray light and watched my own truck leave my own land. And I will not pretend my heart was steady. It was not. My jaw was set so hard my teeth ached. I did not run down the lane shouting. I went inside, I pulled the camera footage, and I saved it to both drives before I had even put on a pot of coffee. Then the voicemail came in. "That truck is not parked on your property, sir. It is parked on a community easement. It has been removed accordingly." That was the morning I drove to the impound, paid $240 to get my own truck back, and found Summit Hook and Recovery, and the name D. Falk on the bottom of the invoice. And that was the morning I sat in Carol's old sedan in the impound parking lot and understood, finally, the difference between a fight Diane wanted and a fight she could not win. She wanted me to sue the association. That fight takes years, costs more than the truck is worth, and lets her run up legal fees with other people's HOA dues while she waits me out. She wanted me angry and broke and loud. What she did not understand, because she had never once read a single document in this whole affair, was that the tow had not been ordered by the association at all. It had been ordered by a private company that had towed a vehicle off, private, deeded, posted, land without a court order, without a law enforcement request, without any legal authority whatsoever. In this state, that is a crime. It is theft, and it exposes the towing company to treble damages. And it had been authorized in writing, with a signature, by the president of the association acting outside any jurisdiction she could name. I went home and I made some phone calls. Not to a lawyer, not yet. The first call I made was to the county clerk's office, where I had friends going back decades, and I asked a simple question about Summit Hook and recovery. The answer surprised me, and then it did not. Summit Hook was a small outfit, 2 trucks, owned by a man named Carl Petrie, who was 66 and had been trying to sell the business and retire for 2 years with no takers, because 2-truck tow companies in a county this size do not exactly draw a crowd of buyers. Carl had a contract with Greg Falk's development company for site-clearing tows. And that contract was most of his revenue, which is why Carl had done a 5 a.m. job off a posted private driveway when Diane Falk called, against his own better judgment, because the Falks were his biggest client. He could not afford to say no. I want to be careful here, because Carl is not the villain of this story, and the law would agree with me. Carl had made a bad call under pressure from a client who had lied to him about who owned the ground. Carl owned the truck, the rig, the license, and the liability, though. And Carl was tired, and Carl wanted out. So I called Carl Petrie directly. I did not threaten him. I have found that threats are what people reach for when they do not have the facts, and I had nothing but facts. I told him who I was, that the truck he had towed before dawn was sitting on land my grandfather bought in 1938, that I had the certified deed and the recorded plat and the camera footage of his rig coming up my posted lane, and a folder 3 years thick, and that under this state's law, a tow-off, posted private property without a court order or an officer present was not a tow at all. It was a conversion. It was theft. There was a long silence on the line, the kind of silence where you can hear a man rubbing his face with his hand. Then Carl said quietly, "She told me it was Association Common Ground. She showed me a map. I asked him who drew the map. Falk's office," he said. Greg Falk's office printed it. Had a seal and everything. I wrote that down, the seal and everything, because a forged map with a seal is a different animal than a misunderstanding. Then I made Carl an offer, and I want to tell you exactly how I made it, because it is the hinge. The whole thing turns on. I told them I was not interested in suing a tired man 2 years from his retirement. I told him the surveying years had been good to me, that Carol had been careful with what we put away, and that I would buy Summit Hook and Recovery outright, the 2 trucks, the licenses, the gravel yard off the county road, and the client contracts, at a fair price, an honest price. And then I told him the one condition. The Falk development contract came with the company, all of it. Carl was quiet again, and then he laughed, low, the way a man laughs when something heavy he has been carrying a long time finally slides off his back. "You want to buy my company," he said, "to fire my biggest client." I told him that was not quite it. I told him I did not want to fire anybody. I wanted to own the company that owned the contract, so that the next time Diane Falk picked up a phone to have a vehicle hauled off ground she did not own, the call would come to my yard, and the answer would come from me. We met the next morning at his yard, where the 2 trucks sat with their booms folded and a coffee can of cigarette butts on the step of the office trailer. I brought my checkbook, the deed, and the folder. Carl read the deed slowly, the way a man reads a thing he wishes he had read a week earlier. "If I'd seen this," he said, "I'd have told her to call somebody else." I believed him. By Thursday afternoon, the paperwork was drawn by a title attorney we both trusted. By Friday at noon, I owned Summit Hook and Recovery, 2 trucks, a gravel yard off the county road, and the site clearing contract with Falk Development that Greg Falk had been counting on to move dirt on his 40-lot expansion. I did not call Diane to gloat. I want to be clear about that, because the temptation was there and I let it pass. I did not call her at all. I let the documents do what documents do, which is sit there being true until the right person reads them. The right person turned out to be a room full of people on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks later at the regular Cedar Hollow Owners Association meeting in the clubhouse, which under the association's own bylaws was open to the public. I am the public. I went. I brought Eli, who was 18 by then and tall enough to see over the heads in the back, and I brought a single accordion folder, and I sat in the 3rd row and waded through the budget report, the pool resurfacing debate with my hands folded. When the floor opened for the part of the agenda Diane liked best, the enforcement update, she stood at the front in a magenta blazer and read off her list of ongoing violations, and my name was on it. She said the words she had said for years, that the Brennan parcel was functionally part of the community, and that enforcement was proceeding. A few neighbors nodded. Most just looked tired. And then she said the sentence that ended it, because she could not help herself. And as some of you know, she said, the association recently had to have a non-compliant vehicle removed from a community easement at the owner's expense, which I think sends the right message about how seriously this board takes our standards. I raised my hand. Diane saw me, and something flickered across her face, but she had built her whole authority on never backing down in a room, so she called on me. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I have a surveyor's voice, flat and slow. The voice you use to tell a landowner the fence he built is 3 feet onto his neighbor. I said my name, and I said that I owned the 14 acres above the development, and that I wanted to correct the record on 2 points. First, I unfolded the certified deed and the recorded 1938 plat, and I held them up and I said that this parcel had been deeded to my family in fee simple 80-some years ago, that it had never been annexed into Cedar Hollow, and that the association had no more jurisdiction over my fence than it had over the weather. I said I was a licensed surveyor, and that the line was where the deed put it, where the iron pins stood, and that anyone in the room was welcome to walk it with me. The room had gone quiet. Diane started to say something about the easement, and I held up the second document. This, I said, is the tow invoice for my truck. Why? It was removed from my deeded driveway at 5 in the morning without a court order or a law enforcement request, which, under state law, is not enforcement. It is theft, and it exposes the towing company to treble damages. I let that sit one beat. I know that, I said, because as of Friday, I own the towing company. I have surveyed land and weather that knocked grown men off their feet, and I have never heard a room go as still as that clubhouse went. Diane's mouth was open, and nothing came out of it. In the back by the door, I saw Deputy Ray Soto, who I had quietly asked to attend as a courtesy, lean his shoulder off the wall and straighten up, because the word theft had been said out loud in a public meeting with a deed and an invoice on the table, and now it was a matter he was obligated to look into. He did not have to take my side. He only had to read the paper. The paper took my side for him. What came out over the following weeks was the rest of it, the part Diane had kept behind the curtain. With the tow exposed as an unauthorized act and a sheriff's inquiry opened, a board member named Linda Cho, who had served 2 years and had been uneasy for at least one of them, drove up my lane on a Sunday afternoon with a folder of her own. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had photographed that first cream-colored letter. And she laid out copies of meeting minutes and an email chain, and her hands were not quite steady doing it. I kept telling myself it was just enforcement, she said. I kept signing off because everyone else did. The emails showed Greg Falk's development company had been pushing the board through Diane to establish on paper that the East Slope was community common ground because Greg needed a road easement across my pasture to make his 40-lot expansion pencil out. And those lots were worth a great deal of money and worth precisely nothing without a way to reach them. Diane's letters, the invented setback, the fines, the fake inspector, the dawn tow, all of it had been one long campaign to manufacture a paper trail of association control over land that was never theirs, so that Greg could stand up later in front of a county board and argue the easement had been established by years of practice. It was not aesthetic policing. It was land assembly, run through a covenant book, with my family's 80-year-old deed as the one thing standing in the road. Linda asked me if she had waited too long. I told her the truth, which was that she had come on the right day with the right paper, and that on paper, the day is the only thing that matters. Here are the two numbers I asked you to hold. Over 5 years, Diane Falk's Association levied fines against my deeded property, totaling $450, of which the amount they ever lawfully collected was $0. Not $1. Against that, once the unauthorized tow opened the door, the consequences that fell on the Falks' own scheme came to a great deal more. Greg's 40-lot expansion died the day it became public that the only road easement crossed deeded private land with a clean title 80 years old, because no lender on earth funds a subdivision whose sole access route runs across ground the developer does not own and provably cannot get. The option Greg had paid good money to hold on the 3 downhill parcels lapsed worthless. Somewhere north of $250,000 gone, the way money goes when the thing it was betting on turns out never to have existed. The association, facing a sheriff's inquiry and Linda's emails and a deed that any first-year law student could read, voted Diane out at the next meeting by a margin that was not close. The new board sent me a short letter on plain white paper with no gold seal anywhere on it, formally acknowledging that the Brennan parcel had never been within association jurisdiction and apologizing for the actions taken in its name. I filed that letter, too. It is the only piece of Cedar Hollow letterhead in the whole folder that I did not mind keeping. Carl Petrie retired that summer and sent me a card. I kept the towing company running for a year under a manager, mostly because I had told Carl's 2 drivers their jobs were safe, and I meant it. And then I sold it to one of those drivers, on terms he could afford. I never towed a single vehicle for Falk Development. The contract simply expired, unrenewed. The way a thing dies when nobody needs it anymore. The evening it was all over. The night after the vote, Eli and I sat on the porch where Carol's garden was coming up along the rail, the same garden that had made a 15-year-old boy ask if he could stay. He was 18 and bound for a surveying program in the fall, which he had decided on his own, and which, I will admit, put something in my throat I had to look at the pasture to swallow. He asked me if I had been scared. That morning the truck went down the lane. I told him yes. I told him a man can be scared and still keep his hands steady, and that the steadiness is not the absence of the fear. It is what you do with your hands while you are afraid. He nodded like he was filing it away. Out past the fence, the iron pin stood where it had stood since 1938, where my grandfather drove it, where my line still ran true. The truck was parked on the gravel where it belonged. So here is the lesson, and I am going to say it plainly the way I wish somebody had said it to me 40 years ago. Your deed is only as strong as the records you keep next to it. Go to the county recorder and pull a certified copy of your deed and your recorded plat, and read them and walk your line until you can put your hand on every pin. When a letter comes that you know is wrong, do not answer it angry and do not throw it away. Date it, photograph it, and file it, because a folder 3 years thick is worth more in front of a judge than the loudest argument you will ever make. If somebody touches your property without a court order or an officer present, that is not a dispute, that is an act. And you write down the day and the time, and you save it to 2 drives. Talk to your neighbors, because the ones being squeezed by the same hand will stand next to you on paper when it counts. And know the difference between the fight they want, which is long and loud and expensive, and the fight you can win, which is quiet and patient and already sitting in a folder on your kitchen table. If you have got a story like this, a clipboard that came for something your family built, drop it in the comments, because I read them, and so do a lot of folks who are right now sitting on a deed they have never pulled. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one, because next week I am going to tell you about a woman who inherited her father's lakefront cabin and the HOA that quietly tried to absorb 200 feet of her shoreline while she was settling his estate, and the 1950s water rights filing in a shoebox in his closet that turned the whole thing around in a single afternoon at the county counter. I will see you then. Keep your records. Walk your line.